Welcome to Restitutio, Aaron Schellenberger. So glad you could be with us today. Thank you for taking some time out of your schedule.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate you having me here.
So today we're talking about your master's thesis, and your title was An Evaluation of Bart D. Ehrman's Twofold Challenge to Establishing the Resurrection of Jesus as a Historical Event. First of all, I love that title. I'm just a huge fan of long titles, always have been ever since I encountered books from the 1800s and just saw these epic long titles. I think the longer the title, the better. But for our audience and those who maybe not know, who is Bart Ehrman and why did you decide to write about him of all people?
Well, Bart Ehrman is very popular. He is a New Testament critic who offers a number of objections to establishing the resurrection of Jesus as a historical event. And a lot of Christians are questioning their faith because of his writings. As a matter of fact, Ehrman was once a Christian. He followed Christ for a while and then later on abandoned his faith. He did not abandon the faith because of him becoming a New Testament critic. He abandoned the faith because of the problem of evil. And then later on, he got more into details about trying to tell people that the resurrection cannot be established as a historical event. He's not denying that it did not, that it happened, okay? What he's denying is that historians, qua historians, can establish the resurrection of Jesus as a historical event.
Okay.
For the reasons that we'll be getting into.
So. Very good. So Ehrman, I mean, he calls himself Ehrman, but I think most of us call him Ehrman. But his popularity, I think, is really
right
a driving force here because, you know, if he was just some obscure scholar, I don't really see him making any original claims or arguments, in all honesty. And I haven't read all of his corpus. I mean, he just pumps out book after book after book. They all go to the New York Times bestseller list. He makes tons of money on them, and he's a controversialist. But what is interesting and important about him is that he is so well read. He is so popular on YouTube. There's a lot of videos of him, and he is very influential among Jesus scholars, historical Jesus scholars. If you look at the great courses, the various Christian courses on the Gospels or New Testament or early Christian history, they're all taught by Ehrman. So he's somebody that you got to do business with if you're seeking to defend Christianity, wouldn't you say?
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, one main reason why he is very popular is because he is a very good communicator.
Yes, he is.
He writes very well. He speaks very well. He debates very well.
Yeah.
For that reason, he is honestly one of my favorite communicators, not necessarily as a New Testament scholar or an atheist or an agnostic, because he calls himself atheist agnostic. He is atheist when it comes to the existence of other gods. Well, when it comes to the existence of the Christian God, but he's agnostic when it comes to the existence of other gods.
Interesting.
But he is very influential because he communicates well. And you made a good point about the fact that the material that he puts out is really not new. It's been around for a while now.
Yeah.
It's just now coming in to the forefront of the laity and the, you know, in the popular apologetics. So and I agree that we have to answer his objections. And to me, the objections against establishing the resurrection of Jesus as a historical event is very important. And we have to provide a good answer for that.
Well, let's talk about the resurrection. Why is the resurrection so important? Why is that what you chose to focus on rather than God's existence, the reliability of the Gospels, textual criticism, or the problem of suffering, other issues that Ehrman also attacks in several of his other books? Why for you was resurrection so attractive and important?
Well, in a number of ways. First of all, the resurrection is the heart of Christianity. That it is a historical event that the New Testament portrays it as. And if that historical event did not happen, guess what? According to Paul, we're still in our sins
Hmm.
and we'll never rise from the dead. The
Yeah,
resurrection of
that's kind of a
Jesus,
big deal.
yeah, that's our key to our immortality. So that's one. The other one is it is God's revelation. God, it is God's way to tell us, hey, I exist, I love you, I sent my son, who is a human Messiah, and he died physically. He died for our sins, and he was raised back to life by me, says God.
Yeah.
And the resurrection of Jesus is the heart of the matter.
Yeah. Well, Aaron, would you say that if the resurrection of Jesus didn't happen, if somehow you could be convinced to believe that the resurrection of Jesus didn't happen, would you still be a Christian?
That is a tricky question in my view,
I'm just
because
curious.
yeah, because when I say the resurrection of Jesus, I'm talking about the bodily, physical
Yeah.
coming back to life,
Yeah.
unto immortal life. Okay, that's my definition of the resurrection. Now, if we say that that did not happen, would I still be a Christian? It depends, because the resurrection can be defined now, whether or not that can be backed up by scriptures, can be defined as a spiritual resurrection. He didn't physically become alive. He just became alive in the spirit world somehow, sort of like a Jehovah's Witness version of the
Okay.
resurrection, if that makes sense. So
Okay.
I might go in that route,
Uh-huh.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. I
But
think
I
for me, I would totally quit. Just
really,
yeah. Oh yeah. Like, yeah, if I
you
could be
would still be a
sure,
Christian, but you
if
would
I could
not.
be relatively sure that Jesus was not raised from the dead, I would stop being a Christian. Yeah.
Hmm,
Yeah, I'm
that's
just
interesting.
I'm a hardliner on that question.
But you
Um,
wouldn't deny God's existence, right? You
no,
would
no, I
still,
think we
okay,
have really good reasons to believe in God's existence.
right, right,
I would be unmoored from the Christian faith and need to investigate, others more seriously than I have in the past.
right, right,
I think my default would be to just go to Judaism because that's comfortable and because, I so love the Hebrew Bible anyhow. But yeah, I mean, for
that's
me, the
interesting. Yeah,
resurrection
yeah,
of Jesus, like if it didn't happen, I'm not gonna stick around. And if it did happen, then it's the single most important event in all of human
right, right.
history.
So you
That's
would not consider the version that Jehovah's Witnesses are,
Yeah, I don't know.
have.
I don't know. To me,
Okay.
that version where there's still a dead body in the tomb, is that part of their belief?
Well, part of their belief is that the dead body somehow, just disintegrated,
Okay.
but that's
Yeah.
that's speculation on their part.
I'd have to think
So,
about it some more because I'm
right,
not
right.
as familiar with their their position. So, but let's get to your topic, your thesis.
Sure.
Let's go ahead and dive in. What are these objections that Ehrman raises? Give us just a brief overview before we really dial in.
Okay. So Bart Ehrman offers a number of objections to establishing the resurrection of Jesus as a historical event. My thesis identified 3 of those objections, and I aim to briefly address the first and critically examine the second and the third.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the first objection that I've identified is what I call the general unreliability of the four canonical gospels. The second one is what I call the intrinsic improbability of miracles. And the third one is what I call the absolute inaccessibility to the supernatural.
Okay.
And so turning to the first one, the general unreliability of the gospels, and you can always stop me if you have any questions or things to expand on or
Yeah, yeah.
whatever.
Let's just briefly, before you get into the first one in more depth. I think the first one's pretty easy to understand, but let's get into what these other two ones mean just very quickly. When it comes to unreliability of the Gospels, that's self-explanatory. If we can't trust the Gospels, then the evidence or texts that say Jesus was raised from the dead are no longer worth considering. But on these other ones, the intrinsic improbability of miracles,
Yeah.
what does that mean? Just in a brief, couple sentences.
Okay, so yeah, I'm gonna have to do more than that. Two paragraphs here. So this second objection states that number one, miracles by their very nature are least probable events. Number two, historians can only establish what is probable. And number three, because of those two, historians cannot establish miracles as probable events. For how is it that historians who are only able to establish what is probable can possibly establish least probable events,
Okay.
like a miracle of the resurrection?
All right.
So
Let me
I have a
pause you.
response to that,
Okay. Yeah.
in my thesis. So
Yeah. Yeah. You have a response. But that's this idea of miracles as being, by definition, improbable. And since they're improbable outside the purview of the historian, since history only deals with what's
probable,
what probably happened.
right?
And then this last one, the absolute inaccessibility to the supernatural. What's that?
Yeah, according to Ehrman, historians, qua historians, or as historians, can only adjudicate historical claims. Historians cannot adjudicate theological claims like the resurrection of Jesus. And here, I think Ehrman is partly right and partly wrong. He is partly right because the resurrection does have a theological aspect to it, namely, God performed the act of bringing a dead man back to life. So indeed, historians, by the very nature of their profession, do not have access to God or any supernatural power.
So this one is the idea that since the resurrection is theological, historians shouldn't even have to talk about it. It's just sort of outside their area.
That's correct.
Okay.
And so regardless of their religious or non-religious background, in the conventional historiography, historians apply what is called methodological naturalism, which is an approach that disallows any supernatural power in a historian's inquiry of any event claim. Now, I want to make sure that we make a distinction between methodological naturalism as a method, okay, is not to be confused with metaphysical naturalism, which makes a bold claim that requires a justification. Metaphysical naturalism says that God does not exist and the natural world is all there is. So I just want to put that out there.
Okay. Yeah. And we'll get more into that. But let's circle back to this first objection that you handled, the general unreliability of the Gospels, because most Christians are going to hear you talking about improbability of miracles or the inaccessibility of the supernatural, and they're just going to say, Aaron, whatever, man, the Bible says Jesus was raised from the dead. I believe the Bible, therefore Jesus was raised from the dead. So we really do need to deal with this issue of the unreliability of the
of the
Gospels, because
Gospels. Yeah.
if the Gospels are fundamentally unreliable, then how can we know really anything about the resurrection of Jesus? So let's hear a little bit about this and really get into it in depth. Where should we start about the unreliability of the Gospels?
In my view, from what I've learned in my studies of the Gospels, um, the Gospels to me are reliable.
Mhm.
They're generally reliable, and there are lots and lots of information that can be extracted as historical facts. And as a matter of fact, even Bart Ehrman himself extracts many of his historical facts to come up with his own theory of who Jesus was. In Bart Ehrman's view, Jesus was an apocalyptic prophet. And later on, Bart Ehrman wrote a book, Jesus being a failed apocalyptic prophet, Jewish apocalyptic prophet. And so I'm wondering, okay, so if the Gospels are unreliable, why are you able to, why do you get to manage to extract those information and come up with your own theory?
Yeah,
So it
yeah.
sounds to me you're being hypocritical, or maybe you're just saying that to try to, you know, gain popularity, or I mean, get a lot of your books sold.
Hmm.
You know,
Yeah.
sometimes I kind of wonder about Bart Ehrman, being a sensationalist. I'm not saying he's just that. I think he's that. He's not just that, but he's that too. In addition to being you know a historian. So
Hmm.
to
Yeah.
me, the Gospels are reliable. Okay, I start with that. But in my thesis, even if we grant that they're unreliable, generally speaking,
Hmm.
I think the four gospel are still reliable enough for us to be able to extract or mine historical facts so as to be able to establish the resurrection
Yeah.
as the historical event.
Hmm. Yeah. I think many Jesus scholars, many historical Jesus scholars, certainly those involved with the various quests for the historical Jesus,
Okay.
they begin with this assumption that because the miracles because the Gospels record miracles, therefore we can't just accept what the Gospels say at face value. Now, interestingly, for Ehrman, he doesn't really position himself in that way. Instead, he likes to focus on discrepancies between the Gospels. And you've got a nice quote in your thesis. I wonder if you could read. Do you have your thesis there?
Yeah.
Uh, let's see here. Page 15.
15.
You see that quote you have
Okay, let
from
me.
Ehrman or Ehrman? I go back and forth.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, while you're pulling that up, I mean, this is really the linchpin for a lot of, I don't know. Typically I just call it liberal scholarship.
Sure.
Liberal scholarship says, all right, well, we're going to go ahead and do history on Jesus or history on Paul, and we're going to reconstruct what actually happened from these theological documents that can't be trusted. And
Right, right.
as a Bible believing Christian, personally, to me, that's just like a supreme waste of time. But at the same time, this liberal approach to scholarship dominates certainly a society of biblical literature,
Yeah.
and most universities in the United States, at least today,
Right.
that if you go to a university and take a class, like for example, Ehrman himself is at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. You go there to take a Bible class, like
Okay.
the first thing he's going to do is hit you with a quote like this. Could you read that for us?
Okay. Are we talking about in terms of the death of Jesus,
Yeah,
that
what day did
paragraph?
Jesus die on? Yeah, that whole part.
Yeah, yeah. He has these words. What day did Jesus die on? That's a simple question. And luckily, we're told in both Mark and John. In Mark's gospel, we're told that Jesus died the day after the Passover meal was eaten in Jerusalem. John tells us explicitly, chapter 19, verse 14, that Jesus died the day before the Passover meal was eaten, on the day of preparation for the Passover. That's different, he says. He couldn't die both days. What about the time? According to Mark, he died at 9 in the morning. According to John, he wasn't condemned to death until afternoon, John 19:14. These are accounts that differ from one another. Did Jesus carry his cross the entire way to Golgotha, or did Simon of Cyrene carry it? It depends which gospel you read. Did both robbers mock Jesus, or did only one of them mock him and the other come to his defense? It depends which gospel you read. Did the curtain in the temple rip in half before Jesus died, or was it after he died? It depends which gospel you read. End of quote. But he also has another one here if you want me to read it.
Well, it's I think it's just more of the same. You know, it's expanding beyond into the resurrection appearances and stuff, and looking at how there are differences between the gospels. So this is a standard speech that Ehrman makes. I've heard him make it in multiple debates. I've heard him do it in classes at the great courses that I've taken. I actually read his entire New Testament textbook. I had to for school, cover to cover.
Oh, okay.
You know, it's in there. And then his Jesus book that you mentioned earlier from the 90s.
Right.
I read that one too. The Apocalyptic Prophet of the New Millennium, which I actually really enjoyed that book. I thought that book was great, except for the part where he doesn't believe that Jesus is the Son of Man, and the part where he says Jesus, failed, and since there's no resurrection, he proclaimed this kingdom, but it never came. So I thought the book was actually really helpful in a lot of ways. But ended just tragically in this position of really Albert Schweitzer. I mean, he's really just echoing Schweitzer, maybe not in all the details, but to a large degree. Him and Paula Fredrickson, E.P. Sanders, Dale Allison, a number of
Dale Allison, yeah.
Dale
Allison has, he's really big on that too.
Yeah. What was his book? I have it over there on the shelf somewhere. Something about an apocalyptic prophet.
Yeah.
Very similar approach. And so the driving force for this whole quest to discover the historical Jesus from the Gospels is this very, very dogmatically held belief that the discrepancies in the Gospels are so severe that we cannot trust both Mark and John. And the historical Jesus scholar doesn't want to say, oh, well, I'm just going to pick Mark and throw out John. They want to say, well, I will pick certain parts of Mark and certain parts of John, certain parts of Matthew, certain parts of Luke.
Yeah.
And, they'll maybe pick a couple of parts of Thomas, Gospel of Thomas. And, they've got Pliny the Younger, Tacitus, Suetonius. There's other sources that they can work from a little bit. The Talmud has a little bit too. But the Gospels are the most, and Paul, I suppose. But and they're trying to decipher like what is reliable out of these because they cannot be trusted. So your thesis, though, your approach is not trying to defend the Gospels or the New Testament or the Bible as a whole. Instead, you're saying, look, I'll just grant you that the Gospels are unreliable for the sake of this argument. Not that you necessarily believe that, but you're going to grant it for the sake of the argument.
Yes.
Why did you decide to take that approach?
Because there is this way, I believe, that can be used in establishing the resurrection as a historical event. It is what I call the minimal facts approach.
Okay.
Now, there are a number of apologists out there who are against that approach. You have Lydia McGrew and a number of other apologists out there. But this minimal facts approach is advanced primarily by Gary Habermas and Michael Lacona and even William Lane Craig.
Yeah.
And to me, this minimal facts approach is very attractive.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's not to say that the minimal facts seals the deal, and I'll explain why. Because we're only trying to extract historical facts, certain historical facts. You have the burial by Joseph of Arimathea, the discovery of the empty tomb. You have the belief, well, the experience of the disciples having seen Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
and the origin of the belief in the resurrection, that is, God raised Jesus from the dead.
And those are the four main minimal facts.
Right, that can be extracted from the Gospels. And now, I'm not saying, however, that those alone can establish the resurrection as a historical event.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll explain the reason why. Um, to add to those four facts, you also have Paul as having seen Jesus on his way to Damascus. And you also have the brother of Jesus, James, who was a skeptic and then believed Jesus' resurrection later on.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can add those two there.
Yeah.
Now, even all of those together, to me, they're still not enough to establish the resurrection, but they give us a confidence that there are some historical data that can be used to shore up the historical, establishing the historical historicity of the resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I say that it's not enough to use those minimal facts is because you have to know what the resurrection definition is. The
Mhm.
resurrection means that God raised Jesus back to life. So God is involved in the process.
Right.
And so, in my view, the following are part and parcel in establishing the resurrection. You have God's existence, God's involvement with humanity throughout history, the religious context of Jesus' life, and God's wanting to raise Jesus from the dead. So God's being factored in to establishing the resurrection, in my thesis, leads me to Ehrman's second and third objections. So I'll stop there and we can have a discussion about it.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope everyone was able to follow that. That was a beautiful summary of the Habermas / Craig minimal
Slash
facts
Lacona.
approach.
Right.
Yeah, Lacona as well. Case for the Resurrection book that he did with Habermas back in the day.
Yeah.
But I want to add to that the historical consideration that N.T. Wright likes to bring up,
Okay.
that you have to also account for, and this maybe fits under the belief in the resurrection, you have to account for the sociological factor that there was a group of Christians
Okay.
after their leader got publicly humiliated and executed. And so the way Wright explains it is, well, if your Messiah gets killed and you've got messianic movements either side of Jesus, what everybody does is either they get a new Messiah or they go home.
Right.
And so,
Yeah.
I think that's just to add, I'm not disputing what you said. I think what you said was a beautiful summary.
What you said just
this is also
add to
true.
shore up the
Yeah.
historicity.
So you also need an alternative explanation for why Christianity was compelling among Greco-Roman people, among Jewish people first, and then among Greco-Roman people, considering the fact that their Messiah was executed. Like, what is attractive about that? Why would you follow that sort of faith? What's it doing for you? So it puts a lot of burden on a historian of early Christianity like Ehrman to be able to say, okay, yeah, he was a failed prophet. He got it wrong. He got executed, publicly humiliated and everything else.
Yeah.
But this X, whatever X is, must have been so attractive that a movement still began under his name. So that's
Right.
something to think about. I want to come back to this
That's interesting. Yeah.
this whole subject of reliability of the Gospels.
Sure.
I know you're a Mike Licona fan. I'm going to go ahead and admit to also being a Mike Licona fan. Probably not as much as you. I think you took classes with him, right?
Yeah. He was one of my professors at my seminary, Southern Evangelical Seminary, home based in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Very good.
Yeah.
And I've listened to his podcast a little bit and watched a couple of his debates. I wonder if I know. Have you probably come across this book here?
Yeah, I got that book.
That's the differences. Why are there differences in the Gospels?
Right.
Where he leans heavily on Plutarch and comparing the various parallel accounts in his biographies
Right.
as a way of standardizing the level of accuracy expected by ancient historians, and then applying that or comparing that to the Gospels and saying, look, guys, this is the same level, the same range of accuracy that we also see in the Gospels, and we are putting our own anachronistic desire or penchant for preciseness on this ancient biography that they so basically it's our problem. The discrepancies in the Gospels are our problem. Not they're not an ancient, no ancient person would have, like that paragraph you read from Ehrman, no ancient person would have said, oh, those are really compelling reasons not to trust these biographies.
Yes.
So I wonder, because I know that this book didn't come out until after you were done with your thesis and everything. Did he ever talk about this in class? And what's your take on it? Do you go with him on that? And I know Lydia McGrew has been very critical, and others.
Oh yeah. Especially
watched a debate.
Lydia McGrew is really critical of
she wrote a whole book against him
on the Gospel of John. Yeah. Because Lacona says that there are some things that Jesus said there that were not historically spoken by Jesus, and Lydia McGrew vehemently disagrees with that.
Yeah.
So as to the book,
what about his general approach, though? What do you think about it? Is it decent, or are you an inerrancy guy? Or
no, I don't believe in inerrancy.
Where do you put your
that.
stake in the ground?
I'm more of the way Dr. Dustin Smith sees the Bible as, you probably saw my interview.
I haven't had a chance yet. So
I interviewed him about
it for me,
about the Bible, relating to inspiration, canonization, interpretation, and application of the Bible. So I'm more of someone who grants discrepancies, but they're not really. Some of them are reconcilable. The Bible does have problems, but not too problematic that we can't rely on it. So going back to that book, at the time that I had Dr. Mike Lacona, he was already talking about the material that he wanted to put there. He described the way the gospel writers patterned their way of writing and way of composing the biography of Jesus, being similar to the contemporary writings of Plutarch. You mentioned Plutarch, right? There is what's called displacement. So there is one historical aspect that the writers of the gospel displaced over elsewhere, right? Plutarch did a lot of that, and a number of other ancient contemporary writers. There is the telescoping, right? You have Mark, who speaks and writes very short occurrences, but you also have Matthew telescopes, expands on certain details that Mark has in his gospel. So there is displacement, telescoping, and a number of other things that Mike had already taught his students even before he wrote that book. And it's really interesting. And it seems to me that because Mike is an inerrantist, he believes that the Bible has no errors. His attempt was to show that, hey, these quote unquote contradictions can be explained the way, if we look at the way, uh, writers like Plutarch wrote his writings. And
Yeah.
so I remember Dr. Lacona would use the word or the term hermeneutical waterboarding. In other words, he says that because he criticizes a lot of the evangelicals that that do hermeneutical waterboarding. In other words, they come up with all kinds of ridiculous, attempts to
Right.
reconcile
Right.
differences.
They're called harmonies,
Yeah, they're trying to
harmonizations.
harmonize them that
Yeah.
they sound so ridiculous, So anyway, so he's against that
Yeah.
waterboarding. You know what waterboarding is? You're
Yeah.
gonna try
Yeah.
to you
Just
try
drown
to
you and
interrogate somebody by
force
drowning
feed
them,
them.
and
Yeah.
yeah. So
Wow. I know this is not our main topic for today, so
sure.
I appreciate you giving me the cutting me some slack, giving me the flexibility to go off script here a little bit.
Oh, that's not a problem.
Um,
I'm enjoying this.
This is fascinating stuff, and you know what? We need to talk
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
So I guess we could maybe enumerate 3 positions with respect to inspiration. You've got your classic inerrantist, which would art like McGrew style, would argue for, or Southern Baptist, argue for, or Craig Blomberg, explanations. They would
Yeah.
argue for there being a way to harmonize any issue that you find between the Gospels. And that's probably the majority of Christianity. Well, maybe not. Yeah, probably the greater amount of Christianity, greater percentage would be in that category of like, there's some sort of, I might not know what the explanation is, but there's some sort of it. Let me just finish this real quick. And then the second one would be this Lacona approach that says, yes, inerrancy is true if we apply their standards instead of our standards to what counts as an error.
Right.
And then the third level would be, no, inerrancy is false. They were just doing whatever they were doing, and we have to use other criteria of authenticity to guarantee or to decipher if this actually happened or if this didn't happen. And maybe there's a fourth one in there too, but that seems to be like the range of options.
To be an inerrantist, right?
Well, the third position is not to be an inerrantist at all.
The first 2 are, yeah, okay.
Yeah, the first 2 are. So you have like the classic and then the Laconian style, which is using their standards instead of our standards for what counts as an error.
Yeah.
And then the third would be not affirming inerrancy at all and saying, well, if we admit that there are errors between the Gospels, then we also have to admit that we need some sort of criteria, or criterion at least, of authenticity to determine what is true and what is not true.
Yeah.
And that has a whole slew of problems itself. And I don't know if you ever came across Luke Timothy Johnson's book back in the day, The Real Jesus. He went through a lot of these questers and said, look, these guys are all applying the same criteria of authenticity, and each one has its own Jesus. It's radically different than the others. As you got the cynic sage Jesus, you got the apocalyptic Jesus.
Right.
You've got all these different Jesuses, and yet they're all applying the same methodology. And then Luke Timothy Johnson, who I believe is a Catholic, his takeaway was, well, I think the methodology is flawed. So any one of these positions you adopt is going to take work and to sustain it. But it's really a fascinating topic to figure out, don't you think?
Yeah. The way biblical inerrancy is formulated when I went to Southern Evangelical Seminary, this was directly from Dr. Norman Geisler, who passed away, I believe, last year or 2.
Yeah.
Is as follows. It's actually a deductive argument. So you have premise 1, the Bible is God's word. Okay. Premise 2, God cannot make mistakes. Conclusion, the Bible cannot make mistakes. So it's a deductive argument. If we grant the premise that the Bible is God's word, okay, and the premise God cannot make mistakes because he doesn't lie, he cannot lie, he tells truth and nothing but the truth, it follows necessarily that the Bible cannot make mistakes. It cannot lie. It is infallible. It is inerrant.
Mm-hmm.
And so, okay, I get it, but one way to refute this deductive argument is by questioning premise one: the Bible is God's word. In what way do we mean? Do we
Yes.
regard the Bible as God's word? Well, what do
Right.
you mean by that? That gets complicated.
Yeah, well,
Very
that gets into
complicated.
different theories of how we got the scriptures. And you have on the one end the dictation hypothesis,
Right, right.
which is to me sounds a little bit like mechanical. Like
Yes, yes.
the various authors had nothing to do with it. To on the other side, just sort of a loose view of inspiration, and then there's a lot of middle positions as well.
Yes.
So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and then you also have God cannot make mistakes. Okay, so now we get into natural theology, not just the Bible, but you already have this natural theology in place. Are we classical theists? Are we Molinists? Are we open theists? I didn't really become acquainted with open theism until I became a biblical Unitarian, by the way. And when I started hearing it, it makes sense to be an open theist.
Yeah.
So can we be open theists and affirm premise two, namely God cannot make mistakes? Well, it depends what you mean by. So that too can get complicated.
Hmm.
So
Yeah. Well, I want to come back to resurrection because
sure, sure.
essentially,
Yeah.
essentially, your case is that even if we grant that there are discrepancies between the gospels, even if we uh, don't assume inspiration or inerrancy and just treat the four gospels as historical documents like any
Yes.
other historical documents from the same period of time, that even if we just approach it that way, there's
Okay.
still good evidence to believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ as a historical event. Is
Yes, I
that
think
is that
so.
a summary of what you're saying?
Yes, but I have to qualify that
Okay, yeah,
by
please.
even with all of those things that I enumerated, the burial by Joseph of Arimathea, the
Hmm.
discovery of the empty tomb, the appearance of seeing Jesus alive, the origin of the disciples' belief that God raised Jesus from the dead, Paul's conversion on his way to Damascus, James, the brother of Jesus, conversion. Even with all those in place, those things don't really seal the deal for the resurrection, but they do shore up the historical aspect of the resurrection. Because the resurrection of Jesus is not just historical, it's also theological. That makes sense. So we can't really divorce theology from history. Those things go hand in hand.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very good. With respect, you call it the GUG, the General Unreliable the Gospel. I love your acronyms, by the way. They're
Yeah.
I think they're great.
Yeah.
Um,
I came up with they're short and they kind of rhyme a little
yeah,
bit because
yeah,
yeah, the general unreliability of the gospels, and then the intrinsic improbability of miracles, and then the absolute inaccessibility to the supernatural. So
yeah. It's great. Um, I don't know if it was Lycona or Craig or one of these guys in debates and maybe some other sources as well. They actually will turn the tables on this whole discrepancy in the Gospels issue when it comes to resurrection appearances. And they will say if all of the resurrection appearances fit together and seem to be so perfectly laid out, no one would
Okay.
trust them because they would argue that the gospel authors were
Are
colluding
colluding.
with
Yeah.
each other,
They're in
right?
collusion. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You hear a
So
lot about that from
yeah, go ahead.
Lee Strobel.
Oh, Lee Strobel. Okay, yeah,
Yeah,
maybe it
yeah, yeah.
was a
But yeah,
case, one of those
Lacona
case
and
for
Craig did
books.
mention, yeah, that too. But yeah. So I think uh, going back to what you asked me earlier about uh, our ability to establish all these facts, historical facts, I'm sure you're familiar with the criteria in establishing
Mhm.
um, events as
Authenticity.
historical facts
Mhm.
or supposed events as historical facts. You have um, the dissimilarity
Mhm.
criterion, the embarrassing
Mhm.
criterion. You also have the multiple attestation. So,
Yeah.
in one degree or another, these 8 facts that I presented can be established as historical facts because they meet one or more of those criteria. There are
Right.
a number of other criteria. I'm sure you're
Yeah.
familiar with that
Yeah,
because
I'm
you're a
familiar with them.
historian.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's a really powerful approach, I think. And what it does is it basically, as an apologist, what you're saying is, you know what, I'm just gonna come into the liberal Christians, or the not liberal Christian, liberal scholarship, or as they like to call themselves, critical scholars, as if
right,
like no
right,
one else is critical but them. But I'm
right.
gonna come into their world and I'm gonna play the game their way with their
Yes,
rules,
right, right.
and you still get a resurrected Jesus.
That's
You
right.
still applying all their restrictions to what you can and can't do. You
Right.
still come up with a really strong minimal facts case.
Yeah.
And so I think there's just incredible value in this approach, even if most of us are thinking to ourselves, well, this is just sort of like an exercise. It's an intellectual exercise, you know.
Right, right. Now,
I think there's value to it.
here is where I have problem with Craig, Lacona, and Habermas. When they present the minimal facts, right? It is as though, it's a done deal.
Hmm.
Well, it depends. If you're someone who is already a Christian, who is having doubts about the historical aspect of the resurrection, yeah, sure. But if it's someone who is really a skeptic and,
Yeah,
especially for that of an atheist, that's not enough.
yeah,
Let's be honest, man.
yeah.
Because
It's a historical riddle to explain how these facts could be true, right? It leaves
yes,
them with a
and the
riddle,
fact
not
that
necessarily with the gospel.
yes, and the fact that the idea that a dead man, a truly dead man, becoming alive is extremely unlikely.
Yes.
That's just that never happens.
Hmm.
Now, obviously, we can get into philosophical objections. Well, there are so many things that are extremely unlikely, but they do happen.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll get into that in our future episodes together.
Sure, sure, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's an important subject for us to cover. Um, but as far as today goes, is there anything else you'd like to say by way of conclusion on this issue with respect to Ehrman and his approach?
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much again, Sean, for allowing me to be on your show. And it's an opportunity to share my take on the matter. Um, in summary, Bart Ehrman is very popular, and because he's a very good writer, very good communicator, and the skeptical world is celebrating. And we have a good number of Christians who are doubting their faith, questioning their faith. A good number of them had actually abandoned their faith and become atheists.
Yeah.
Some of them don't become atheists or agnostics. They become, liberal Christians or progressive Christians. That's another topic altogether. And I just want to say that, hey, we have answers. We can even play by the rules of critical scholarship. They call themselves critical scholar because they think they're doing it the right way because they're objective and they're unbiased.
They're
Well,
not
no one is
objective.
objective.
They're not unbiased.
Yeah,
They're
no one is
so.
unbiased. We're
I would
all
say they're just as
yeah,
fundamentalist as like the hardest core fundamentals. I'm sorry. I went to a seminary where like
yeah.
the critical approach was like the only approach. I also studied under Paula Fredrickson a little
You
bit.
did.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
And
snap.
like it was taught as dogma. Like you have to do it this way. You can't think, you can't pursue scholarship, outside these parameters, and these are
You
our
know,
dogmas, and you have to agree with them. And I just don't think that it's a fair statement to say that they're unbiased.
you know,
Just
a
different
couple of things.
biases.
One is we're going to get into why that is a dogma. It has to do with the current conventional historiography's
Yes,
philosophy
we are
that
going to get into that. Yes.
they don't allow God or
Right.
any supernatural power to be in the picture. That is why. Okay.
Mhm.
And I have a proposal in my thesis as to how we ought to proceed. And
Yeah, modified historiography. This is going to be a great episode. Stay tuned
right,
for it.
right. And there's one other thing that I forgot. So
Well, we'll come back.
it's gonna come back. Yeah,
We'll come back. We'll be sure to pick that up. But I think one last thing I'd like to make just before landing the plane here and saying
right.
goodbye is that Lycona famously went up to Gary Habermas when he was a student and said to Gary Habermas, "Professor, I don't think I'm a Christian anymore. I found differences between the Gospels, and I think I have to give up my faith now." And Habermas said, "Lycona, Mike, do you still believe that Jesus died for your sins? You still believe God raised him from the dead? Do you still believe that he's returning?" He just went through like these minimal facts about the gospel itself, not the gospels, but the gospel of salvation itself.
The message.
And and Lycona's just like, yeah. Habermas is like, dude, you're still a Christian. It's okay. It's not the end of the world. What you're struggling with is the subject of inspiration and inerrancy. And I think it is important for us to separate those two, at least a little bit, to say, look, the gospel message is first, and resurrection is really at the core of the gospel message. So that is a non-negotiable, but like how you view the gospels, how you view the Bible as a whole really is extremely important, but it's secondary.
Yeah. So the second thing, by the way, that I was going to expand on, because you mentioned it, that liberal scholars think that they're unbiased, they're objective. Well, no one is unbiased. We're all, to a certain extent, we can't be fully objective. We can be, to a certain extent, be objective. So our job is to manage our bias. That's why we have peer reviews. And that'd be my second thought on that one. So going back to what you said, it's not the end of the world, because even if the Bible is full of errors and the Gospels are generally unreliable, we can still have confidence in the resurrection of Jesus because we have enough historical evidence to that end. So
I'm just gonna say for the record, I don't think the Bible is riddled with errors. I think it's inspired. But anyhow,
well, I agree. Yeah,
to end on that note, I didn't want to leave people like just in despair there.
Yeah.
But thank you so much, Aaron, for your hard work on this subject. How can people follow you and get to see some of your work?
Well, I'm sure you're going to be providing a link to my YouTube channel, and if anybody wants to contact me, they can go that way.
Okay.
Just
and what's it called
comments. Again? Life and Beyond.
Life and beyond.
Right.
Wow, that sounds pretty cool.
Yeah. Thank
And
you.
and your name is Aaron Schellenberger. So if you type in Life and Beyond, you might get some weird stuff. But if you type in Aaron Schellenberger, also, you'll definitely find the right guy, right?
Yeah, I haven't actually tried that, but yeah, maybe.
Well,
But
I guess we'll
I know
find
you'll
out.
provide a link.
If enough people type it in, maybe YouTube will create a way to
Right,
get to
right.
you. But hey, thanks so much
Algorithms,
for
yeah.
thanks so much for your contribution on this today.
Yeah. Thank you very much again, John.